Last Shabbat, we read from Sefer Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes. Famously, the third chapter lays out a series of binaries, couplets that remind us life has ins and outs, ups and downs. Sometimes we feel like things are going well, that our lives are full of blessing. And so the negative aspects of Kohelet's framing feel less relevant. We're focused on healing and building and laughing and dancing. But this week, many of us are having trouble accessing those life expressions. The binaries of Kohelet are too frequently, I think, not in a state of equilibrium, but this week, the equation is profoundly unbalanced. What does it mean, or what does it sound like, for the times and seasons of our lives to be this and not that? This is what it sounds like. A time for dying, a time for uprooting, a time for slaying, a time for tearing down and weeping and wailing, a time for throwing stones and shunning embraces, a time for losing, discarding, and ripping, a time for hating, and a time for war. In fact, the only binary that doesn't seem obviously this and not that comes in verse 7, Eit lachashot ve'eit ledaber, a time for silence and a time for speaking. Quite honestly, I feel trapped in the middle of that one. I feel I must speak, but how can I speak of unspeakable crimes? Eicha begins the book of Lamentations. How? How could this happen? A question both sincere and unanswerable, if ever there was one. Now, I'm not talking about the epistemological how, not about whether we ought to believe Hamas's motivations or Islamic jihad's or Iran's aspirations, not about the stunning unpreparedness of the intelligence community, not the hubris and extremism of this current Israeli government that played a role in what unfolded. No, I'm talking about the ontological how, the existential how. Eicha. Eicha is a word for those with no words. The same word shows up with different vocalization in our Parsha this week. Ayeka. Where are you? God calls to Adam and Chava after they eat from the tree. And a version of that same word shows up in the next chapter. E hevel achicha. Where is your brother Abel? God asks Cain when God knows very well the answer to that question. It's the story of Cain and Abel, of Cain and Hevel, I want to speak about today, because after a week of bloodletting and terror, I find myself wondering about that first murder, the slaughter of one person, one brother, at the hand of another. Now the man knew his wife Chava, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gained a person with the help of the Holy One. She then bore his brother Hevel. Hevel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain became a tiller of the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to God from the fruit of the soil, and Hevel, for his part, brought the choicest of the firstlings of his flock. The Holy One paid heed to Hevel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering God paid no heed. Cain was much distressed, and his face fell. We all know what happens next. God warns Cain not to overreact. Sin crouches at the door, he's told. Don't give in to your baser instincts. Don't allow your life to be animated by grievance and hate. But Cain does not listen, and the Torah tells us, Vayakom Cain el hevel echa achiv v'yahargehu. Cain set upon his brother Hevel and killed him. And God said to Cain, Hevel achicha, where is your brother Hevel? And he said, I do not know. Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper? God asks a rhetorical question. We know where Hevel is. Cain asks another. We don't get an answer to Cain's question, but we know the answer. And we know in our very bones when we read this story that Cain's failure is not only that he introduces violence to the world, even that he slays his own brother. Cain's failure is made worse by his callousness, his victim blaming, his utter disregard for the life that he has just snuffed out. Who is Cain? He is jealous and petty and lazy and selfish. He brings an underwhelming offering and expects overwhelming approval. And when penalized for his crime, he has only complaints. My punishment is too great to bear. When I think about 1,300 and more Israelis, most of them Jews, but surely not all, who were slaughtered this week, thousands more who were injured, 200 abducted and taken to Gaza, I can't shake the mere scale of the carnage. It's not just the numbers, but the brutality of these atrocities, the utter disregard for human life. Apparently, there are somewhere around 300 soldiers within that number, which it seems to me means that about 75% of those killed, butchered in the most horrific ways imaginable, were civilians, women and men and children and babies, the elderly. God doesn't dignify Cain's pathetic dodge with a response, proclaiming instead, Kol damei achicha tzoakim elai min ha'adama, your brother's blood cries out to me from the earth. In fact, it is from this very verse that the Mishnah in Sanhedrin derives its famous teaching, because the Hebrew here for blood isn't singular, it's in the plural, not dam achicha, but damei achicha, your brother's bloods. Our lives are not just our own. They belong to every person who cares for us, every future generation that might come from us. That's why to take a life is to destroy a world. Hevel's life is snuffed out before he can say a word, but the ground does not forget. The very soil carries the memory of what was done to him. It shrieks because he cannot. Eit sfod. There is a time for wailing. The word hesped, from the word sfod, often mistranslated as eulogy, means a shriek, a wail. It is the sound our heart makes when it breaks. Whitman's barbaric yawp as the only sensible response to barbarism. The Rambam says that it is a positive Torah commandment to cry out when our community suffers, not to make sense of it all, not to obfuscate and equivocate, but to scream, to allow our hearts the necessity of cracking open and revealing our deepest anguish. That's the mitzvah right now. Even so, what can we learn about these characters from our parsha? The moment when Cain murders Hevel is shrouded in mystery. The Torah tells us Cain said to his brother Hevel, but then we aren't told what he said, just that he kills him. But Targum Pseudo Yonatan, the late Aramaic translation and interpretation of the Torah from Eretz Israel, fills in the gaps to help us better understand just what separates the two brothers. It reads, Cain said to Hevel, Leit dayan veleit din. There is no judgment. There is no judge, nor a world beyond this one, nor will reward be given to the righteous, nor punishment to the wicked. Who is Cain? He's a nihilist, justifying his villainy, his depravity through moral relativism. There is no right and wrong, only victory of the strong over the weak. And who is Hevel? On one hand, he's the embodiment of ephemerality. Hevel means vapor, breath. As the book of Kohelet begins, Havel, Havalim, Hakol, Havel. All is transient. Nothing lasts. But Hevel is more than a victim, a phantom. The Targum gives him a voice, redeems his voice, and Hevel answered and said to Cain, there is a judgment, and there is a judge, and there is a world beyond this one, and a good reward given to the righteous, and punishment for the wicked. And with these words they quarreled in the field, and Cain arose against Hevel, his brother, and drove a stone into his forehead, and killed him. Cain murders Hevel because Hevel is selfless. He shows up with the choicest of his flock. He expresses gratitude, placing something greater than himself at the center of the universe. And yes, for all these things, Cain destroys him, just as Hamas destroyed so many in the space of a breath, in the worst anti-Semitic massacre since the Shoah. There are some, if not bright spots, acts of bravery and heroism that have become clear for this past week. Like the story of the 33-year-old Israeli-Canadian Adi Vital Kaplan, who saved the lives of her husband and father, her 4-year-old and infant sons, only to be murdered in front of them. Or Shlomi and Devorah Matthias, who shielded their 16-year-old Rotem, who subsequently survived after hiding for half a day with a bullet wound to his stomach. But these are the exceptions, and they're hardly cheerful tales. Most of the stories are just all layers of tragedy, like that of Captain Sagi Golan, who was killed while attempting to rescue families at Kibbutz Be'eri. He was supposed to get married to his partner Omer this week. Instead, singer Ivri Leader came to his funeral to sing the song that was meant to be played for him and his future husband. The song was Ani Yodea Shezachiti Le'ahov. I know that I deserve to be loved. Sagi Golan deserved to have his wedding. Rotem Matthias deserves his parents, as do the family of Adi Vital Kaplan, and so very many others who were blotted out by an enemy seeking not justice or peace or even liberation for their people. Hamas wanted brutality. Hamas sought and has, of course, succeeded to exact the ultimate price on its own people as well. The twisted logic of the nihilist who wishes to create maximum chaos, unmitigated harm. That's why even as Israel drops flyers and urges Palestinians in Gaza to flee southward, Hamas insists that they stay, makes it hard for them to flee. Because make no mistake, the higher the body count, the better it is for Hamas. Should we mourn for innocent Palestinians in Gaza who have lost and will lose their lives in the coming days? We most definitely should. But intelligence failures notwithstanding, I have no problem at this moment laying the blame for those deaths primarily on the ones who insisted, without asking them, that they die for their twisted cause. And that cause is not the establishment of a peaceful, democratic Palestine. No, their goal, Islamic Jihad's goal, Iran's goal in funding and training terrorists, is the eradication of the state of Israel, and if necessary to achieve this goal, every Jew within it. You may be sitting there at this moment thinking, what happened to the Daniel Burg who preaches about the essential value of human life, who insists on the other side of Kohelet's equation on gathering stones and seeking and keeping and loving and peacemaking? I promise you, I'm still here. Each of us, especially in moments like these when the rawness of our emotions threatens to rob us of our humanity, it is now that we must insist on that humanity. I don't want to hear anyone call Hamas animals. They are human beings, despite their choice to act with inhuman cruelty. I don't want to hear anyone try to erase the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza, in the West Bank, family members abroad who are mourning their dead. That suffering is real and long-standing, especially in Gaza. Torah resists zero-sum thinking. As my teacher, Yehuda Kurtzer, said this week, empathy shouldn't be understood as a limited commodity. That's exactly why kinship ethics insists that we care first for our children and then for others. It's not selfish and it's not cruel to love our own first and more, to defend our own against violence, to call out a mass murder for what it is. I love you, says Kurtzer, because I understand what it means to love my children. That's why the Talmud says if you have to choose between Jews and non-Jews, that the Jewish people can come first. The poor or the rich, the poor come first. The poor of your own family and the poor of your town, your poor come first. The poor of your city and the poor of another city. Aniyei icha kodmim. The poor of your city come first. Notice that it doesn't say instead, just first. The sages of the Talmud in Masechet Ta'anit taught, when the Jewish people is suffering and one of them separates themselves from the community, the two ministering angels who accompany a person come and place their hands on that person's head and say, this one who has separated himself from the community, let him not see the consolation of the community. The price of belonging is solidarity. The question for us, if we aspire to be more like Hevel and less like Cain, is not should we choose Israelis over Palestinians. It is this: if we must choose one to fight for first, can we not choose our own? And then just as soon again as we can focus on both, do that. However, I know such a statement is hard to hear. On some level, it breaks my heart to say it. But magical thinking about utopian solutions, well-intentioned though they may be, will not bring back our dead. They will not free our captives nor heal our wounded. The German-American philosopher Leo Strauss, whose 50th yahrzeit occurred the same day Hamas began its rampage against Israeli civilians, wrote about the dangers of this kind of magical thinking. There is a Jewish problem which is humanly soluble, the problem of the Western Jewish individual who or whose parents severed his connection with the Jewish community in the expectation that he would thus become a normal member of a purely liberal or a universal human society, and who is naturally perplexed when he finds no such society. The solution to his problem, he writes, is to return to the Jewish community. our Jewish community, our people, our family. Some of them are flesh and blood family. Some of them the extended family of Am Yisrael. They are fighting and they are dying. This week has been Eight Lisbod, a time for wailing. The foreseeable future will be an Eight Milchama, a time for war. May the war last only as long as it must. May its victims on both sides be as few as possible. May the soldiers fighting for the Jewish state not lose their bearings, their sense of moral purpose, and may they not give in to their baser instincts. Am Yisrael Chai, we say, may the Jewish people live. May the Jewish state survive. May it prevail, so that the Palestinians one day might also have a state of their own, so that the state of Israel can become more just, more democratic, more compassionate, more accountable. This first, then all of that, and please God more. Shabbat Shalom.